Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I had the pleasure today of reading this book, this print-on-demand book that I ordered off Amazon on Fleury Mesplet, the first printer at Montreal. So this is an essay really that was published in 1906 originally, and it also includes, a lot of primary material just scanned in here. But the reason I picked it up is because I became interested in Mesplet after reading about him in another book on early Canadian printing. And he has the distinction of not only being the third printer to ever set up shop in Canada. You had the first printing press set up in 1751 in Halifax by Bartholomew Green. You had a second one set up in 1764 by Brown and Gilmore in the city of Quebec, and then you have Mesplet setting up his shop in Montreal in 1776. Now, if you know anything about American history, that date is going to stick out to you. You're going to say to yourself, why would a printer be setting up a printing press in Montreal in 1776? Well, the answer is Benjamin Franklin and the Continental Congress asked Mesplet to go to North America in the first place and then to go to Montreal to set up a printing press. They were under the assumption that Quebec, the province of Quebec, that Canada would be eager to join the 13 colonies and the Continental Congress in their revolt against the British government, in their revolution. Now, in 1776, Quebec had been a British colony for 16 years. Prior to that, they had been a French colony, hence why the colony, the entire province, spoke French, and why there's such a prominent French presence in Canada today. But Mesplet himself was from France. He was born in Lyon, France in 1735, and ended up moving to London in 1765, shortly after marrying. And he went to London thinking that there would be more economic freedom there, that he would be able to set up his printing shop. But as someone printing in the French language, he did struggle a bit. And that is when he met Benjamin Franklin, who was in London. And Benjamin Franklin convinced him to pick up his shop, pick up everything, pick up his wife. He had no children. To pick up his wife and his shop and his life, and to travel across to North America to settle and to print in French. At that time, they really wanted someone who had the ability to print in French so that they could sort of influence French North America. And one of the first things that he ended up printing when he got to North America, in fact, was a copy of the Declaration of Independence in French. So he goes to North America with a letter from Benjamin Franklin, goes to the Continental Congress, gets a commission from them, is doing sort of okay in the United States, but then they suggest that he go and check out Montreal. Because they are sending a delegation to Montreal. They are expecting that Montreal and the province of Quebec will soon be joining them in the revolution. And so on this assumption that it's going to happen, Mesplet gets some money from friends, takes out some loans, picks up his workshop and his life once again, and journeys north to Montreal, where he sets up shop. Unfortunately, he isn't in Montreal long before the American delegation pulls out, leaving him essentially stuck because his capital is sunk into his type, it's sunk into his printing presses, it's sunk into paper, and he already took out a bunch of loans and got gifts from friends to be able to move there in the first place. So unless he's going to drop and leave everything, he is stuck. which leads to his arrest because obviously, he's an American sympathizer. He was essentially employed by the American delegation, and he gets thrown in jail for 26 days. So on June 18th, 1776, he is thrown in jail. And he eventually is released, but he still has essentially no way of leaving Montreal. And so despite seeing himself as a Republican, despite being someone who very much supports the American Revolution, he stays on in Montreal and begins to print. There is mention of him printing a hymn book. He begins to print newspapers. He starts a newspaper called the Gazette. And he is sort of scraping by on commissions. Now keep in mind that as the first printer of Montreal, he is the only printer. But printing is heavily regulated, heavily censored. Since becoming a British colony 16 years ago, the import of books from France has been illegal except with the express permission of the British government. So if you want to import a book in the French language, you must have the permission of the British government to do so. And any paper, any printing supplies, they are not made in North America, so they must come from Europe. They must come from Britain. And of course, you need to get permission to be exporting that sort of stuff into the colony. And so he is very much filling a gap, but it's not a huge gap because there isn't really much of a demand yet for printing. There is no national literature, people are not used to newspapers, and so he begins with commissions for religious books for the Catholic Church, hymn books, and then almanacs, which I understand were extremely popular in early North America. One of the reasons being that you could use them as a calendar. So you know what day of the year it is, you flip it open and it tells you, is it a holiday? Is it an important day? What should I know about this day in this year? And so he is scraping by, he starts his newspaper, but he's still running into difficulties for obvious reasons. He is actually ordered out of the province of Quebec, and it's only through the efforts of several prominent people who support his printing work that he is able to stay. They all sign a petition, and his expulsion order is canceled, or put on hold rather. And he continues to print, but he's always had Republican ideas. It was his Republican ideas that caused him to leave France to go to London, his Republican ideals that took him to the United States, and his Republican ideas that led him to move to Montreal with the belief that Quebec would soon be joining the 13 colonies. So he frequently clashes with local authorities. He has hired an editor who is also very radical politically, and they print some things that are not so flattering to the local judges, to the judiciary. And they find themselves once again arrested and thrown in prison. And this time he is taken not to the local prison in Montreal, but he is moved to Quebec City, where he spends 3 years and 3 months in prison without trial, which is obviously a failure of the justice system. But I would guess that things weren't exactly as they should have been, given the revolution that was ongoing. And he essentially spent the duration of the American Revolution in prison in Quebec City. And this is where it gets interesting, because he was arrested. All his type, all his printing materials, everything in his shop was seized by the government, inventoried, and put in a warehouse awaiting his release, which is how we have a very detailed understanding of exactly what he had in his shop, what he was able to get, what he was using to print, and also what he had printed to date, because he had obviously some books, some pamphlets that had not been delivered to recipients yet. And so he spends 3 years and 3 months in prison in Quebec City before escaping. And it says escaping here in the text, but there is an asterisk because the American Revolution was winding to a close. The British and the Americans had agreed to sign a peace treaty, and there was really no need to keep him in prison anymore. And so essentially the authorities let him walk out the door, and off he goes back to Montreal, where he once again resumes his printing business and has quite a prolific career in printing, continuing to print almanacs and religious books and his newspaper. But he struggles throughout the rest of his life with debt. In fact, he tries to recoup some of the money that he feels he is owed from the American Congress. He sends letters asking for the sum of several $1,000s, not only for his initial journey in 1776 up to Montreal, but the compensation that he feels that he is owed for the time that he spent in prison, because of his loyalty to the American cause. Now, he is told that if he hopes to get anything back, he must go in person. So once again, he borrows some money from a friend, makes the trip, puts his plea forward in person. He is denied most of what he asked for. He gets no compensation for his time in prison, for the lost income. He is given the sum of around $300 that really sort of, not quite covers the cost of his initial move from Pennsylvania to Montreal. And at this point, the author, being a Canadian, has what I think is a quite funny line to share here. Let me just see if I can flip to it. He claimed that it was insufficient to cover his outlay in securing it, which included expenditure for the services of an attorney, the cost of his trip, and 3 months sojourn in Philadelphia. This was his last appeal to the United States. He had wasted time and money without any practical result, and from henceforth became a good and loyal Canadian. Regardless of whether he was a good and loyal Canadian, he did spend the rest of his life in Montreal, and unfortunately, when he died, he was in debt, and that's how we once again know everything that was in his shop, because his shop, his assets, were liquidated to pay his debts, and so once again an inventory was taken. So I just think he was an absolutely fascinating person, and I wish we knew more about him. In my searches online, my look into other books, this is really as much as we know about him, and likely all that we'll ever know about him. We know the basics about his life, where he lived, who he married, the fact that he never had children. We know a bit about what he printed, about his politics, but we don't know more than really this small little essay here. This is the extent of his life, these pages. And I'm finding learning about early printing in North America absolutely fascinating. So it's definitely something I'm going to continue to explore. And one final interesting note here. So obviously these print-on-demand things are scans of books, but they went ahead and scanned the library pocket card. So at least I know that this was made from a scan of a book at the University of Toronto Library. And if you found this at all interesting, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Or if you know anything about early printing in North America, I would love some further reading recommendations. I hope you're all having an excellent Sunday.